Around 1800, the invention of the cotton gin made it profitable for British textile mills to produce cotton fabric. Cotton was the fabric of choice for clothing manufacturers. Cotton was a crucial component of Britain's Industrial Revolution. By 1831, the United States, specifically the Deep South, was the leading producer of cotton in the world. Britain depended on Southern cotton production. Southern cotton production made the United States a global economic power, second only to Britain. Cotton can only be grown on a particular piece of land for approximately 3 growing seasons before it depletes the soil. The United States needed more land to meet the global demand for cotton. In order to increase cotton production, the United States government removed Native Americans from their land in Mississippi by force. This created 18 million acres of land for cotton production. The government then sold this land to white settlers at a cheap price. Cotton production is labor-intensive, so these white settlers purchased slaves from places like Virginia and Maryland to produce cotton in the Deep South. Millions of slaves migrated from the Chesapeake Bay region to the Cotton Kingdom in the Deep South. The Chesapeake Bay region had a surplus of slaves because of declining tobacco production due to soil depletion. Slaves could be purchased in the Chesapeake Bay region for $400 or less. Meanwhile, slaves in New Orleans sold for as much as $1,200. Slave traders like Franklin and Armfield made a fortune by purchasing slaves in the Chesapeake Bay region and selling them in New Orleans and Natchez at inflated prices. This was particularly the case for fancy girls. Fancy girls were young, light-skinned female slaves who were sold in places like New Orleans for the explicit purpose of sexual exploitation. Fancy girls were generally teenagers, but could be as young as 8 years old. Fancy girls were destined to be prostitutes or concubines. Fancy girls were auctioned for 4 to 5 times more than a female field laborer. Fancy girls sometimes sold for more than a prime male field laborer. Franklin and Armfield purchased young, light-skinned female slaves in the Chesapeake Bay region and sold them in New Orleans as fancy girls for a huge profit. Unfortunately, the firm had a practice of raping these women once they were in the firm's custody. The price of slaves rose along with the price of cotton. Powerful Southern slave owners wanted to import capital into their states so they could buy more slaves. New planters needed loans to buy land and slaves. Louisiana bankers Hugues Laverny and Edmund Jean Forstall allowed slaveholders with few slaves to use their slaves as collateral for loans. Laverny and Forstall then repackaged the loans into bonds that New York and London banks could sell to investors around the world. Working with the London-based firm Baring Brothers and Company, they pressured the Louisiana state government to secure the bonds with public money. With the backing of the state of Louisiana, European investors bought the bonds. This provided Southern banks with more money to make slave-backed loans. Louisiana chartered 3 property banks between 1827 and 1833, all based in New Orleans. The Consolidated Association of Planters of Louisiana Capel, chartered with capital of $2.5 million, Union Bank with $7 million, and Citizens Bank with $12 million. The Consolidated Association of Planters of Louisiana Capel sold bonds to Baring Brothers and Company, which resold the bonds on the British and European money markets to investors around the world. The bonds offered 5% interest and came in denominations of $500 and $1,000. The bonds were backed by the state of Louisiana, which acted as a guarantor should the slave owner default on the loan. Each bond represented an investment in thousands of slaves as opposed to just one. The investor benefited from slavery without the risk of owning slaves who might die, run away, or engage in rebellion. It was not illegal to own bonds, even if slavery was illegal in the country where the investor lived. Banks, all over the South, accepted slaves as collateral for loans. Southern banks such as Canal Bank of Louisiana allowed slave owners to offer their slaves as collateral for loans. This Southern bank, along with Citizens Bank, would eventually be purchased by New York bank J.P. Morgan. A slave-backed loan could be acquired in 2 ways. First, slave owners could take out a mortgage on the purchase price of a slave by putting a percentage down and paying off the balance over time. Second, slave owners who already owned slaves could use those slaves as collateral for a loan. Louisiana encouraged banks to make big loans. The state mandated where these banks should open branches and the number of mortgages that would be issued. Britain and much of Europe were bankrolling slavery in the United States. This occurred several decades after the transatlantic slave trade was banned. Europeans could express their opposition to slavery while profiting from slavery. Slaves became more valuable than all of the railroads and factories in the United States combined. In the early 1830s, cotton prices continued to rise. European investors poured more money into the Southern economy by purchasing slave-backed bonds. As a result, the price of slaves rose along with the price of cotton. A slave that was previously worth $400 was now selling for as much as $1,200 and higher. The amount of cotton being produced was increasing to the point where in 1834 the supply of cotton began to exceed the global demand for cotton. Cotton prices began to decrease and then those prices plunged. This led to the Panic of 1837. Planters who were depending on the rising price of cotton to pay their loan no longer had the money to pay their loans. These planters were underwater. The price of slaves also fell along with the price of cotton. A slave that was purchased for $2,000 could only be sold for $60. Planters could not sell their slaves to cover their debts. In addition, the price of land also fell. Planters could not sell off their land to cover their debts. Planters defaulted and investors demanded payment from the state of Louisiana. The state of Louisiana was not willing to tax the public in order to pay off the huge debt. And it was not willing to foreclose on the planters and destroy the state's economy. This made the debt toxic. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst depressions in American history. The depression lasted until the mid-1840s. Profits, prices, and wages dropped. Westward expansion was stalled, unemployment rose, and pessimism abounded. Many of the banks that made slave-backed loans went out of business.